Hi, it's Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, at the Bayit, and we are studying the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, or Guide to the Perplexed. And we are starting, very exciting, we are starting the final chapter today. I do have a suspicion that perhaps other people may have difficulty logging on today. So if you're able to hear my voice, and you cannot log on for some reason, try going to the Facebook group webyeshiva.org on Facebook, and you'll be able to see it live there. Otherwise, the recording will be available later. Okay, so we're starting chapter 54 today, and just we have to get our bearings. This is a very important chapter, not only because it's the last chapter, but rather because I feel it's where the Rambam presents, I guess, arguably one of the most important central themes that runs through the entire guide, which is the ultimately man's purpose and what he's supposed to do with his life. So I'm just going to share my screen uh, to uh, to help us get our bearings. And here we are. Okay, so in this final chapter, the Rambam feels a need to reconcile two seemingly opposing projects, and that's really what I feel ultimately is the objective of this chapter. The Rambam had set forth throughout this work that the ultimate objective of the Torah and of worshiping God is intellectual perfection. Every mitzvah that I do does not have any other utilitarian benefit than leading me towards intellectual perfection. Sometimes it does that by making my body healthier. Sometimes it does that by helping to perfect my ethical virtues. But all of that is a means to a greater end, which is my intellectual perfection, so that I can understand reality and that I can understand God in the process. However, there seems to be another directive that is equally valid in the Torah that the Rambam seems to feel a need to reconcile with this idea that he set forth. And that is, it says in the Torah, V'halachta bidrachav, which calls upon every Jew to emulate God, not only in one's thoughts, but in one's behavior. Previously, in chapter 27 of the third section, among other chapters, the Rambam had argued that those mitzvot which engender moral virtue and physical health are only a means to a greater end of intellectual perfection. Where then is the place for doing actions that make one imitative of God's actions? How does that reconcile with the idea of intellection being the only truly divine worship that is not a means to a greater end, but the ultimate end in and of itself? So the Rambam is going to introduce us to a few new concepts and then sort of get at the very end of the chapter to the punchline. We're not going to see the very end of the chapter today. We're only going to do part one, and then we're going to finish with part two of chapter 54 in 2 weeks from today, because we're going to take a week break due to my travels. So the Rambam starts off this chapter by telling us, I want to give you an introduction that is necessary in order for you to understand what I'm about to disclose in this chapter. First of all, he says, and again, this is using the same theme that he had used throughout the first part of the guide, which is to take a word in Hebrew that is found commonly in Tanakh, to explain it properly, to tell us when there are multiple meanings of that word, and then to break it down for us. So the Rambam's focus for the beginning of this chapter is the word chokhmah, the word wisdom, which is found in Tanakh. What does that word chokhmah mean? And you might think, well, it's simple. It just means wisdom. But the Rambam tells us, no, it's not so simple just to define it as wisdom, because that's just taking the Hebrew or Arabic and turning it in, or chikmah in Arabic, and turning it into English. But there are four different kinds of chokhmah that are meant when you ever encounter this word in Tanakh. So wisdom number one, and that's the highest wisdom, and it's the highest objective for every man, as the Rambam will explain, it refers to an acquisition of knowledge of all that exists with the goal of better understanding God. The more I understand about reality that exists around me, myself, nature, space, the universe, the more that I will be able to understand God Himself. And that is the ultimate objective. Now, the verses that reflect this idea is from the book of Eov and from the book of Mishlei, the book of Job and the book of Proverbs. As Job had said, "V'hachochma me'ayin timatzeh," from whence will you find wisdom? Ve'eze mekom bina, where is the place of understanding? Lo yada enosh erka, that no human being really appreciates the value of wisdom. There are many things that you can easily find and quantify their value. But this kind of wisdom, the wisdom of knowledge of everything, has infinite value. And it is very rare to find this among the living, because most people who are living cannot attain this very elusive level of wisdom, of a knowledge of everything. And that's how the Rambam says, I know from this verse in Job that we're talking about not just book knowledge, not just savvy street smarts, but we're talking about a wisdom that far surpasses that. Another verse that is indicative of that, the word chokhmah means something truly lofty, is what it says in Proverbs chapter 2, Im tivakshena chakasef v'chamat monim techapesena, that even if you seek it out like silver and like buried treasure, you try to find it. Az tavin yirat Hashem v'dat Elokim timsa, only then, if you really search it out as something that's truly precious, like buried treasure, then you'll be able to understand the fear of God and the knowledge of God you shall find. Ki Hashem yitain chokhmah mipiv da'at u'tfuna, God will grant wisdom from His mouth, knowledge and understanding. So here again, the Rambam is perhaps using this second verse that he's quoted, this verse from Proverbs, to say that it is such a rarity to be able to acquire this level of wisdom, and it only comes from God's good graces. I will remind you that throughout this last section, what we've seen as far as what intellectual perfection looks like for the Rambam is that it's a bilateral process where the human being works on perfecting his intellect, and in turn, an emanation comes down from heaven to connect with that human mind and connects it with the mind of the universe, the active intellect, or whatever you want to call it, that divine overflow that we've been speaking about in the last several chapters. And the Rambam says that this usage is frequent. So whenever you find chokhmah, most of the time it'll be of this nature, this really rare kind of wisdom of the knowledge of everything. But sometimes you'll find the word chokhmah referring not to, this profound, all-encompassing wisdom, but it means the acquisition of a skill or a craft. And when we look at the construction of the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle, we will discover that this kind of term is used to describe people who possessed craftsmanship. So, for example, it says, "V'chol chacham leiv bachem," that anyone who is of a wise heart shall come and help in the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. Similarly, in that same chapter, chapter 35 of Exodus, just later on in the chapter, it says, "V'chol isha chachmat leiv biyadeha tavu," that every woman who was of wise heart was able to weave with her hands the beautiful tapestries that were hanged in the tabernacle. And what that indicates is that when it says that these women were wise, it doesn't mean it's because they had some kind of profound knowledge of God or of everything, but they specifically had a knowledge of weaving, of being able to make beautiful tapestry. And they are also therefore called chachamot, they're called wise women. So therefore you can clearly see that the word chokhmah means something profoundly different in this context from the context from Job and Proverbs. The third application of this word chokhmah refers to not the acquisition of knowledge, not the acquisition of a skill, but rather to the acquisition of moral virtues. And the Rambam here quotes two verses that reflect this. The first one is from Tehillim, from Psalms, where the psalmist in Psalm 105 is talking about a sort of a recollection of the history of Joseph and all that he did when he was in Egypt. Lesor sarav benafsho uzekenav yechakem, that he used his soul to in some way bind Pharaoh's officers or captivate Pharaoh's officers, and he was able to bring wisdom to all of the elders that were in the palace. So Joseph is credited with bringing a certain type of chokhmah, and it's the contention of the Rambam that Joseph brought moral virtue, not knowledge, to the Egyptian court. Now, as you'll see in just a moment, it's because the term Yechakem is related to Zikenim, is related to elders. And the same thing is true in the book of Job, chapter 12, B'yeshishim chokhmah, that among the elderly you will find wisdom, V'orech yamim tuvuna, and with length of days there comes understanding. So the Rambam understands as follows. It's not that Joseph shared deep wisdom with the court of Pharaoh, and it's not that Job is suggesting that it's an automatic process that as you get old, you become filled with knowledge, because that's not logical. There are many people who spend their days watching Wheel of Fortune on TV and watch daytime television and never become any wiser, and they can live well into their 90s, right, and are not none the wiser. But there is a type of chokhmah that is acquired as you get older, and that is the wisdom of virtue, which means you notice that people's behavior changes as they get older. They become more circumspect. They are much more careful in their selection of what they choose to say. And it's because that when someone grows old, the desires of youth begin to wane, and they're able to focus more carefully on the important things in life. When we're young, we don't think about death. We have a lot of passions, and it's therefore more difficult to develop moral virtue. But once you get old, you more easily develop moral virtue. Again, not automatically, but something that does happen to most people with old age. Now, just a few pages ago, we're on page 632 and 633 for chapter 54 in the Pines edition. Just in chapter 51 on page 627, I'm just quoting from what the Rambam had said. The philosophers have already explained that the bodily functions impede in youth the attainment of most of the moral virtues, and all the more pure thought. For it is impossible that it should be achieved, that such wisdom and such moral virtue should be achieved while the bodily forces are in effervescence. In other words, when they're in full drive, when they're in full power and intensity, don't expect a young person to develop moral virtue. It takes a while. It takes age. It takes maturity. It takes a waning of some of the physical passions that young people have. Okay, so those are the first three types of wisdom. And now the Rambam gives us a fourth definition of the word wisdom when it's encountered in Tanakh. Just a moment, please. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh bidvaro. So the Rambam says finally that the word chachma can sometimes be used for a negative connotation as well. So if a person is very cunning and comes up with strategies and ruses in order to be able to best somebody else, sometimes that's called chachma as well. So for example, Paro in the beginning of the book of Exodus said, Hava nitchak malo. He said, come, let us become more chacham than the Jews. And that was how he proposed the enslavement of the Jewish people. Another example is that after Avshalom, King David's son, who would later in life try to rebel against his father and usurp the kingdom from him, Avshalom before then was also known to be somewhat of an upstart because he killed his brother Amnon, justifiably because Amnon had raped their sister Tamar. But because of that, David exiled Avshalom and didn't want to have anything to do with him. David's general and confidant, Yoav ben Tzruiyah, utilized a wise woman to reconcile David and Avshalom, and eventually David welcomed Avshalom back to his kingdom, only to discover later that this was going to be dangerous, and Avshalom would eventually, once being reconciled with his father, would start up an entire insurrection against the monarchy. But in any event, what does it say in the verse? That Yoav, in order to be able to create this reconciliation, Vayikach misham isha chachama, he went to the town of Tekoa, where we know is today outside of Yerushalayim, and he took from there a wise woman. Now here, her wisdom was that she knew how to masquerade as a poor widow whose son had been killed. And all of this was not true. This was just a regular lady. She may have been married with children, had a good life, but she was an actress. And so her chachma was the ability to deceive. Her chachma was the ability to put on a ruse for David. And we don't have to go into the whole story over there, but that's the word chachma as it is referred to. Again, here it's not even being used with a positive connotation. It's being used perhaps with a negative or at least neutral connotation, that it implies someone that can use their cunning in order to deceive other people. Now, this being the case, the term chachma, wisdom, as it is as a noun, when you talk about wisdom in the abstract, it can apply to any time we see the application or acquisition of the first definition, rationality. Number two, the second definition, moral virtue, or number three, or he switches them around. Number three, the achievement of a skill or a craft, or number four, committing an act of evil. Similarly, the noun chacham, not chokhmah, but chacham, which means a wise person, refers to any person who possesses any one of these four. Okay, I just want to make sure that we understand that. And now we're ready to go on. So this is what the Rambam has told us until we get to, now we're on page 633 of the text. The person who acquires complete and true Torah knowledge is called a chacham in two respects. And this is where the Rambam needs to make an important point about the term chachma as it applies to Torah knowledge. Now, a person who gains the knowledge of Torah, you would think that chachma falls into the category of number one. It refers to an acquisition of knowledge of all that exists, which leads to an understanding of God. But as you know, the Rambam had taught us previously in chapter 51, in a very controversial statement, that there are people who could study Torah for their entire lives and not really become of a very high level of intellection, simply because they have never used philosophical proofs and logic in order to demonstrate to themselves the truths of the Torah. So if I accept all of the things that are contained within the Torah just on faith, and I don't try to demonstrate or argue for their truthfulness based on logic, based on what's, there was a whole, this is what philosophers and priests and rabbis and imams would study in their academies for centuries, proving issues about the universe and about God and scientific principles. So if you have a principle of truth and you don't bother spending time proving it, but you rather say, well, I'll accept it on faith because it's contained in the Torah, for the Rambam, you have only gained a certain level of advancement in your intellectual growth. And so therefore we have to say that when the Torah talks about chachma vis-a-vis one's acquisition of Torah knowledge, it is such a person is called a chacham in two respects. Firstly, he has acquired higher rationality through his knowledge of the Torah's precepts, even though he's only accepted the Torah's precepts on tradition and is not basing it on anything that is argued philosophically, but he understands, for example, when the Torah says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hear, O Israel, God is our Lord, God is one. He says, listen, I don't know why the Torah says that you must accept this. I don't understand why God has to be one. I don't understand why God would in any way be diminished if he was more than one. I've never gone through that speculative process of proving God's unitary nature, but I accept it on faith. That's the first type of chachma that you acquire through the Torah, is just an understanding of the precepts and principles of the Torah. Secondly, you acquire a higher morality through that same Torah. You also acquire moral virtue by understanding the precepts of the Torah, because the Torah teaches proper behavior and proper moral, ethical thinking and attitudes to any student of the Torah. So those are two immediate benefits, even for the person who's not a philosopher and isn't interested or doesn't have the capacity to be able to use speculative logic to prove these ideas. But then he says we must qualify the wisdom of rationality that is acquired through Torah study. When one studies the Torah without using logical or philosophical demonstration, He has gained a knowledge of the Torah's precepts based on tradition alone. But this is not a true acquisition of the first type of wisdom, since the concepts have not been proven logically. For this reason, the prophets and sages use the term chokhmah when referring to one who studies Torah. They divide chokhmah into two parts. And this is sort of like wisdom number one, A, and wisdom number one, B, going back to the four types of wisdom. This is all part of wisdom number one, which is a knowledge of all that is so that I can know God. But as it applies to someone who studies Torah towards that end, there's one type of chachma, which is the preliminary, a working knowledge of the Torah, its precepts and laws. But that's not the ultimate chachma. The second chachma, in the general sense, that is a wise methodology that enables someone to prove the precepts of the Torah using logical argumentation, and that too can be plumbed from Torah study, as we'll explain below. Okay, so now let's go on. Whenever you find scripture extolling wisdom in general and the rarity of its acquisition, such as in the verses mentioned in the context of wisdom number one above, scripture refers to this latter form of wisdom, the kind that enables one to prove the Torah's precepts logically, because it is such a rarity for such a thing to be found within an individual. Most people who study Torah only reach the first level of Chachma, which is just knowing the Torah, knowing what it says, and accepting those principles and laws based on faith. But there's a much deeper form of wisdom that is what King Solomon says is so rare. And thus we have verses like, Lo Rabim Yechkamu, it says in Job, not that many people become Chachamim, Uzekenim Yavinu Mishpat, and not all elders will be able to understand judgment. And also the verse that we set up above, also from Job, chapter 28, V'hachochma me'ayin timatzeh. From whence will you acquire, or from whence will you find wisdom? Because wisdom is such a rarity. We're not talking about the wisdom that the Talmidei Chachamim in the yeshiva possess. We're talking about the wisdom that is applied to the Torah and can be extracted from the Torah that proves the truths of the Torah. The sages similarly bifurcate Torah wisdom in this way. For example, when the Talmud talks about Moses, they note that there's a verse in Divrei Hayamim, in the book of Chronicles, that gives different names to Moses. And three out of those names call him Avi something, like Avi Gedor. Avi, Avi, Avi. Why does Moses have the name Avi, the father of, in three of his names? And the answer is, says the Talmud, that the Moshe was Av Batorah, Av B'chochma, and Av B'neviut, that he was a father or a master in Torah study, he was a master in wisdom, and he was a master in prophecy. Now, what the Rambam is demonstrating from this section of Talmud is that you see that even though Moses ultimately received all of his knowledge from his Torah study, but the Talmud divides the two things that he received from his Torah study. Number one, he got Torah knowledge, and that's the face value information that is contained in the Torah that you can accept on faith. And Av B'chochma, but also a master of wisdom, really refers to the wisdom that is so rare to be able to prove the truths of the Torah through philosophical speculation. Another example is in reference to King Solomon, as the Talmud says, Chamishim Sharei Bina Nivru Ba'olam. There are 50 gates of knowledge that are accessible to man in this world. V'kula nitnu l'Moshe chaser echad. 49 of those gates of wisdom were granted to Moses, and the 50th was denied to him. Shenamar v'tachsirehu ma'at me Elokim, that God, you have made Moses only slightly lower level than God himself as far as his access to knowledge. Bikesh Kohelet linso divrei chayfetz, and now the Talmud quotes a verse from Ecclesiastes that King Solomon, who is also known as Kohelet in that book, sought to be able to attain that level. Bikesh Kohelet liot kemoshe, he wanted to be like Moshe. Yatzeta bat kol ve'amaralo, a heavenly voice came and told King Solomon, v'katuv yashar divrei emet, as it is written very clearly in the Torah, v'lo kam navi od b'Yisrael kemoshe. No, King Solomon, you will never reach the level of Moses. So this is also evidence, says the Rambam, by the fact that when you look at the verse in the first book of Kings, which says, Vayechkam mikol ha'adam, that King Solomon was wiser than all men, it gives examples of people who were his contemporaries. Not all people who ever lived. It doesn't say that he was wiser than Moshe. It doesn't say that he was wiser than Confucius, but rather it says Me'itan ha'ezrachi ve'heman v'chalkol v'darda b'nei machol, that all of the people who lived in his time. So when it says that he was the wisest of men, it doesn't mean that he was wiser than Moses. Moses was wiser than Solomon. When it says that Solomon was the wisest, it means among his contemporaries, those living during his lifetime. Now, what kind of proof are we bringing from here that there are two types of wisdom that are extracted from the Torah? Torah and Chokhmah. They're giving the two names, one referring to the book knowledge of the Torah, the face value knowledge of the Torah, and the Chokhmah, the philosophical knowledge that is extracted from the Torah. So the Shem Tov commentary, if I'm understanding him correctly, seems to explain that the Talmud seeks to reconcile how both Moshe and Shlomo could have been the wisest of all men. One could have easily answered that if there are two completely separate forms of wisdom, one which derives from the Torah and the other which derives from an external source, Moses possessed the former and Solomon the latter. The Talmud does not do this, however, because the source of both wisdoms is the Torah, just that one wisdom is overt in the text, the knowledge that is communicated by the Torah without proving it, and the second wisdom, called Chokhmah, must be mined and derived from the text, going deeper into the text in order to be able to extract it. And basically, all the Rambam is trying to demonstrate is that don't think that you need to rely on external philosophy in order to be able to prove the truths of the Torah. If you study the Torah properly enough, you'll be able to actually discover contained within the words of the Torah itself the proofs that will demonstrate the truths of the actual text. But the bottom line is that we see that there are two types of wisdom when we talk about one who studies the Torah. The first is the superficial knowledge of what is contained in the Torah, that we would call that a Talmud Chacham. And the second one is he who has truly attained Chokhmah, of wisdom number one definition, and that is the person who has plumbed the philosophical depths. Now, the proper order of acquiring wisdom, says the Rambam, this is the next topic that he tells us, is that our sages teach that when acquiring wisdom, there is a sequence of acquisition. First, one should obtain Torah wisdom. That is just a face value knowledge, right? The superficial knowledge of the text of the Torah and its precepts. Second, one should attain philosophical wisdom. That is a knowledge of how to logically prove the Torah's precepts. And only thirdly, says the Rambam, should one obtain a complete knowledge of how to practice halacha in his personal life. Now, the Rambam derives this sequence, which is a little bit surprising because you would think that before I become a great philosopher, I should at least know how to put on a pair of tefillin, right? Or I should know how to do mitzvot. But the Rambam says, I'll prove it to you from the Talmud. The Talmud says that in Tractate Shabbat, that Rava teaches that when a person is brought up to heaven, to the heavenly judgment after he passes away, they're going to ask him a number of questions. 3 out of that series of, I think, 6 questions have to do with the pursuit of knowledge. So, when they bring a person to judgment, they will ask him, Nasata v'natata be'emunah, did you comport yourself in business faithfully, in an ethical way? That has nothing to do with wisdom. But the first question has to do with wisdom is, Kavati itim Torah, did you set aside time to study Torah? There it's referring to, says the Rambam, Torah study, qua Torah study, just for the sake of knowing what the Torah says. The next questions of Asakta Bepriya Uravia Tzipita Li Yeshua, did you engage in procreation? Did you daily wait for salvation of a messianic nature? Those are also not having to do with wisdom. So the next one in the list of wisdom issues is Pilpalta B'Chokhmah. Did you engage in going into depth, into Chokhmah? Which the Rambam understands is, did you philosophically prove to yourself the truths of the Torah? And the third question about knowledge is, Hevanta davar mitoch davar, did you understand how to infer principles of halachic practice from the text of the Torah so that you understood how to live your life as a Jew? Now, the Rambam is consistent in this respect with what he wrote in the Mishnah Torah, where he first codified Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, which has to do with speculative issues of knowing God and knowing the universe. and only then he discusses halachic matters in the rest of the Mishnah Torah. He states so explicitly at the end of Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, where the Rambam talks about why he chose to talk about all of this Aristotelian philosophical stuff about physics and metaphysics, as we've talked about many, many times over the course of studying the guide. We pointed out that the very beginning of Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Deot, Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, that section of the Rambam is somewhat anachronistic because it depicts the universe using an Aristotelian model of science, and it may have to be updated because we have a different conception of the universe from Aristotle. But the Rambam went out on a limb and talked about what we called physics and metaphysics, about the nature of God and the nature of the celestial realm and the nature of the natural realm and all of the different elements that exist in our world. He did that because he felt that a proper working knowledge of all that exists, again, philosophical speculation, takes priority over even understanding halachic issues. So you see, he says, and he writes that Va'ani Omer she'ein ra'ui l'tayel b'pardes ela mi shenitmalei kris olechem ubasar. I believe, says the Rambam, you should not be delving in depth into philosophical issues until you fill your stomach with bread and meat, which means to know halachic issues. So the Rambam is not suggesting that you spend years and years studying philosophy and only then study halacha. You have to get the basics of chokhmah, of basics of philosophical knowledge, to the point where at least you can prove to yourself the truths of the Torah. But don't spend a lot of time on it. Just know that this is something that you'll need to come back to, and then go to study halacha. And he proves this. He says, Amru chachamim davar gadol ma'aseh merkava, v'davar katan havayot de'abaya v'rava. That the Talmud itself says that when the Tanakh says that davar gadol, that a wise man knows a large thing and knows a small thing, the large thing refers to the metaphysics of the chariot in Ezekiel, and the davar katan is the small thing, is he knows the halachic debates between Abai and Rav in the Talmud. Afal pichein ru'in hein lahakdiman, and therefore you should know that the reason why I write the issues of physics and metaphysics first, shehein miyashvin da'ato shel adam tchila. He says, no, sorry. The reason why you should study halacha first, even though the proper order is to have a working knowledge of philosophy and physics and metaphysics, is because they give you peace of mind and they are necessary for you to live your life, etc., 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 and they will give you the world to come. They will give you this world so that you can eventually inherit the next world. And the Rambam basically says, I'm giving you only a smattering of Chachma at the beginning of Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. Now study halacha, and then eventually you'll know you have to go back to Pilpalta B'Chochma to really delve in. So he's not contradicting himself. He says, in a perfect world, knowledge of philosophy should always precede knowledge of halakha. But since knowledge of philosophy properly is a lifelong endeavor, and if you waited until you fully mastered philosophy, you would never know halachic practice, you have to just get a smattering, go into halachic study, but then really spend most of your time on philosophy. So now the Rambam then says, after we have made all of these preliminary remarks, hear what we shall say. The ancient and modern philosophers have made it clear that the perfections to be found in man consist of 4 species. So up until now, the Rambam is telling us, this entire chapter has been an introduction to what I really want to tell you. So I've talked about the 4 types of chachma, that the words, their definition, as they will be found in Tanakh. I've also pointed out that study of Torah yields 2 types of chachma, one a superficial chachma, but not true chachma, and it also yields the chachma of philosophical speculation. Now, after I've made this all clear, here's what I want you to know. There are 4 types of perfection in life, where we say that if a person engages in any of these activities, any of these 4 activities that we're going to point out, he has in some way perfected himself or made himself better in some way. He's improved himself. He says the first perfection, this is what we're going to end off today. We're just going to briefly discuss these 4 perfections, and we'll save the rest of the chapter for next time. He says the first perfection is the most inferior, even though most people spend their entire lives pursuing it. This is the perfection of material possessions. They include money, garments, tools, slaves, land, tech, if the Rambam was living in the modern era, and all of the cars and all of the and Teslas and all of the other cool things that come along with that. Also included is the aspiration and the ambition to ascend the societal ladder, such as becoming a king, a politician, a leader, and all of these other ambitions. They are also of this nature, of this first type of improvement, or what he calls a perfection of self. This is not a true perfection of the person, since these acquisitions are not truly innately connected to the person. That is, nothing truly belongs to a person when he acquires stuff or he gets a big title at the front of his name, because you can't take it with you. He says, once a person parts with his assets or with his station in society, he is the same person, not having essentially changed through these acquisitions. Thus, there is essentially no difference between a king and a pauper. Doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter what your station in society is. You are really the same person. So spending your life, and this is why philosophers call this pursuit an ephemeral one, purely of the imagination. One does not really perfect himself through any of these things, because they are only sort of super added to the individual and not made a part of the person. You don't essentially change by having wealth or by having any of these things. Let's talk about the second perfection. The next perfection is more connected to the individual, and that it refers to one's physical and psychological also constitution. It too is not a true perfection, in the sense that this perfection is not unique to the human species, since animals too seek and extol this kind of perfection of being physically strong and of being of sound mind. Furthermore, physical perfection in man is all relative. Compare him to a mule, a lion, or an elephant, and even the strongest man in the world is puny by comparison. So if a person were to spend his whole life going to the gym and becoming really buff, even though there's a virtue in that to become physically fit, no one's arguing that it's okay to let yourself go physically. But if that's your life aspiration, that's what your focus is in life, then you're not really engaging in a human perfection. You're engaging in an animated creature perfection, just like any animal would want to be the most physically strong. If you have a pack of wolves, or if you have a team of apes, there's always going to be the alpha male who's going to try to be the strongest and defeat all of the other animals. So just because you're stronger than everyone, or you may know martial arts, and your body is only has 1 ounce of body fat, that doesn't make you humanly perfect. It just makes you animalistically perfect. The only benefit man achieves with this perfection is the ability to perform physical tasks more effectively. As such, there is really no perfection of the soul, which is the thing that makes us human, the image of God, accomplished in this endeavor. The third perfection, and this is more connected to the human being himself, and refers to the perfection of one's moral virtue. Now, you would say, well, that's great, isn't it? Not for the Rambam. This is only a stepping stone. One attains this moral perfection through an observance of the mitzvot, most of which are designed to engender this form of perfection. Nonetheless, it is important to note that this perfection is not an end unto itself, but rather a means to a greater kind of perfection. To become a mensch, to become chivalrous and polite and kind and benevolent and all of these other things, is not an end unto itself. This is pretty shocking. This is evidenced by the fact that all moral virtue is helpful only when one is in the company of other human beings. Thus, this kind of perfection exists to help other people. Thus, if someone were in complete solitude, if I was on a desert island, it wouldn't really matter how benevolent I was. There would be no utility for moral virtue, since there would be no one there to help. As such, one cannot truly say that someone has perfected himself via the acquisition of moral excellence. So, what is the ultimate perfection? Here's the fourth perfection. This is the true perfection, in that it refers to the acquisition of intellectual perfection. That is, a proper grasp of all that exists, which brings to a proper understanding of divine matters, of God and what he's really all about and how he operates. This is the ultimate objective for man. It brings perfection to him even in solitude, when there's no one to help, unlike moral virtue. It also provides him with immortality because through it man is man. And remember, the Rambam has alluded to this concept many times throughout the guide, that the key to olam haba, to true immortality, is the perfection of the intellect, not moral virtue, not doing the mitzvot per se mindlessly, but the only way you gain immortality is by allowing your intellect to become perfected, because ultimately that's the only part of you that lives on. And if you don't work on perfecting the intellect, then when a person dies, they die and nothing continues. When you consider the first three perfections, you will ultimately realize that they pertain to perfections only in relation to others and for the sake of others, namely wealth only makes you perfect in the eyes of others. Health makes you perfect in the eyes of others compared to other people. And the same thing with virtue. It only is a perfection in the sense that you can help other people, even though they are, according to conventional wisdom, necessary for your and others' benefit. But in reality, they are not really true perfection. But the fourth perfection pertains to you alone, no one else being associated in it with you in any way. Thus, Scripture states, "Yihiyu lecha levadecha ve'en lezarim mitach." In Proverbs, where it talks about the true acquisition of wisdom, it is for you alone. It is a perfection that is for you alone, and no stranger has anything to do with it. So it is not when you are in a society that this perfection is relevant, but rather when you are judged as an individual, regardless of where you live and what position you're in a social order. Therefore, just a direct quote, you ought to desire to achieve this thing, which will remain permanently with you, and not weary and trouble yourself for the sake of others, you who neglect your own soul so that its whiteness has turned into blackness through the corporeal faculties having gained dominion over it. The Rambam seems to be saying that if a person spends his life doing chesed, doing acts of kindness for others, while he may be lauded for his moral virtue in this world, he's wasted his life away. He's blackened himself. Instead of being truly white and pure and holy, he has blackened himself by allowing his mind to go to waste. And this is the meaning of the verse in Shir HaShirim, in the Song of Songs. Al tiruni sha'ani shecharchoret shezafatni hashamesh. Do not look at me, says the Jew who has spent his life doing for others, because I have become blackened by the sun. B'nei imi nitharuvi. My brethren have provoked me or criticized me. Samuni notera et hakarim. They have placed me as the guardian of the other vineyards. I've spent my life taking care of other people. Karmi sheli lo natarti, but I never took care of my own vineyard, my own intellectual perfection. Now, about it, King Solomon also said, Pen titain la'acherim hodech, in Proverbs, he said, do not give to others of your glory. Ushnotecha la'achzor, do not give away your years of life to cruel people. What's the point of spending all of your life helping other people if you're not perfecting yourself? Now, we're going to hold the chapter here, but I want to point out something that should be disturbing to anyone who's listening. At this point in the chapter, we are left quite disturbed. Is it true that acting morally with others, giving charity, extending of ourselves, is not only ineffective in perfecting ourselves, but actually blackens us by distracting us from the true project of man? We will conclude this chapter with the hope of some reconciliation in our next shiur, where we believe that the Rambam is going to pull back a little bit and is going to explain to us the true role of moral virtue, even within the person who wishes to intellectually perfect himself. And he will explain that moral virtue and acting virtuously with others does have a role to play in one's pursuit of intellectual perfection and becoming godlike. So we're going to have to hold that here. As I mentioned, next week we're off, but in 2 weeks' time from now, we will commence and we'll finish the final chapter of the guide. I look forward to seeing you then, and have a good week. Take care now.